I was still holding my fork when she said it. This house belongs to our real father. You need to move out. Her sister didn't even look at me when she added, Mom knows. I waited. I looked at my wife. She kept her eyes on her plate. The room went quiet. I nodded once. Okay, I said. Before I tell you what happened next, if this moment feels familiar, you can tap like or leave a comment about where you're listening from. And if you've ever been quietly pushed aside instead of confronted, you're not alone. Have you ever been underestimated because you stayed silent? My name is Daniel. I'm in my early 40s. For most of my life, I've been easy to overlook. I stayed seated after that. Long enough to feel stupid for staying. Long enough to realize the chair wasn't meant for me anymore. Plates scraped. Someone stood. Someone laughed about something that had nothing to do with me. The conversation didn't resume, it just continued without me in it. Like I'd already left the room. I helped clear the table. Not because anyone asked. Habit, I guess. Or training. When you live your life trying not to be a burden, you learn how to disappear politely. The kitchen light was too bright. Every sound felt sharp, the clink of plates, the hum of the dishwasher, the low voices behind me. I caught fragments. Finally said it. About time. No one lowered their voice. I rinsed a plate and stared at my reflection in the window above the sink. 42 years old. Tired eyes. Shoulders slightly hunched like I was apologizing for taking up space. I looked like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome. My wife passed behind me. Close enough that I could smell her shampoo. She didn't touch me. Didn't say my name. That hurt more than what her daughters said. Because insults from children, even grown ones, you can dismiss as cruelty or immaturity. Silence from your partner? That's a decision. I dried my hands slowly, buying time I didn't need. When I turned around, the kitchen was empty. Just me and the echo of a conversation I hadn't been invited to finish. I walked through the house carefully, like the floors might crack under me if I moved too fast. This place had been loud once. Full of plans. Arguments about paint colors. Late nights assembling furniture with instructions we ignored because we were sure we knew better. I remembered carrying the couch in myself because no one else could take off work. Remembered signing the mortgage papers alone because my wife trusted me with the boring stuff. Remembered thinking that was a compliment. In the hallway, I stopped in front of the family photos. Their smiles were easy. Mine always looked practiced. I took one frame off the wall. Then another. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I just noticed how natural it felt to remove myself from the story. In the bedroom, my wife sat on the edge of the bed scrolling through her phone. Her posture was relaxed. That told me everything. Did you mean what they said? I asked. She didn't look up right away. They're emotional, she said finally. They didn't mean it like that. I waited. She didn't add anything. So, I should leave. She exhaled, annoyed now. Not guilty. Not conflicted. Annoyed. Can we not do this tonight? She said. I've had a long day. That was it. Not they were wrong. Not this is your home. Not even we'll talk about it. Just postponement. Delay. The same strategy she'd used every time something uncomfortable came up. Let silence wear me down until I stopped asking. I nodded again. It seemed to be my move lately. Sure, I said. I slept on the couch. Not dramatically. Not angrily. It just felt appropriate. Like I was already in transition. Sometime after midnight, I woke to laughter drifting down the hallway. A door closing. Someone's footsteps, light, unafraid. People who knew they belonged. I stared at the ceiling and tried to name what I was feeling. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even heartbreak. It was something colder. Clarity. By morning, the house moved around me like I was furniture. The girls grabbed coffee and left without a word. My wife kissed my cheek out of habit, already reaching for her keys. Love you, she said automatically. I believed she believed it. That didn't make it true. After the door closed, I walked into my office. Or what used to be my office. The desk drawer was half empty. Files shifted. A few folders missing. I sat down slowly. They weren't just talking. They were planning. I opened my laptop and logged into the bank app. Numbers stared back at me. Indifferent. They didn't know what had happened at dinner. They didn't care who raised their voice or who stayed quiet. Money doesn't take sides. I checked the property documents stored in the cloud. My name. Alone. Unambiguous. I leaned back and closed my eyes. All those years I thought silence was keeping the peace. Turns out it was just teaching them what I'd tolerate. My phone buzzed. A message from my wife. "Are you okay?" I stared at it for a long time. I didn't answer. For the first time, silence felt like something I owned. I stood up, put my jacket on, and locked the door behind me. Not because I was angry. Because I was done pretending the chair at that table had ever really been mine. As I stepped outside, the air felt sharper. Honest. I took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next. But I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to explain myself to people who'd already decided I didn't belong. And that thought stayed with me all the way to the car. Heavy, steady, and impossible to ignore. It followed me as I drove. It waited with me at every red light. And it didn't let go. The morning was quieter than it should have been. I woke before everyone else, the sunlight spilling thin across the kitchen floor. The house felt bigger than usual, emptier, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for me to do something I didn't yet know. The coffee machine sputtered like it was as uncertain as I was, and I leaned against the counter, listening to the hum of appliances I once barely noticed. From the hallway, I could hear them, the girls talking in low voices, giggling about something, a sound I had learned to interpret as ownership. Even from this distance, I could tell the conversation was about me. About how I didn't belong. And my wife's soft laugh threaded through it, not correcting them, not even noticing that I could hear. That was the hardest part. Not their words. Her silence. I poured myself a cup of coffee and turned to the window. Outside, the neighborhood seemed normal. Lawns being mowed, cars pulling out of driveways, the world going on as if nothing had happened. Inside, I felt like a ghost walking through my own life. Every room I passed reminded me that I had been the one to build it, but now I was merely occupying it, tolerated at best. I tried to remember when this had started. The subtle displacements, the casual dismissals, the jokes at my expense, the way my opinions went unacknowledged. But those thoughts didn't help. They never do. They only made my chest tighten and my jaw ache. Instead, I focused on movement. I rinsed the mug, wiped the counter, rearranged the chairs as if that could restore order where it had been lost. Later, I found myself in the office. The sunlight through the blinds cut lines across the desk. Documents were stacked unevenly, some were missing. My files. My work. I had kept them organized, carefully, because that was one corner of the house where I could still feel competent. Now, even here, there were absences. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind me I wasn't in control. I sat in the chair, the one that felt like it belonged to me, and opened the laptop. Emails, bills, reminders, all routine, all ordinary, all mine. And yet, I felt intruded upon, like even the most mundane aspects of my life had become theater for the others. Every ping, every notification felt like a judgment. You are still here, you are still tolerated, but do not mistake this for welcome. I remembered a comment one of the girls had made a few weeks ago, flippant, but it had stuck. "You're lucky we let you stay here." I had laughed at the time, nervously, thinking it was a joke. Now it wasn't. It had been a declaration. A boundary drawn in their minds, and enforced by my silence. I was quiet. I was compliant. And that made me small. I drank the coffee slowly, tasting its bitterness, thinking about how long I had allowed this quiet erasure to happen. Not because I didn't see it. Not because I didn't feel it. But because I thought restraint was strength. Because I thought patience would earn me respect. I was learning that patience without clarity is just permission. By mid-morning, I found myself outside on the porch, leaning on the railing. The air was crisp, and the wind carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. I imagined the girls inside, plotting their day, their voices carrying a sense of triumph that wasn't mine to share. My wife passed by the window, brief and unremarkable, absorbed in her own devices. I could have called out, confronted them, demanded recognition. But I didn't. I had learned that storms can be measured not by how loudly they roar, but by the patience with which you stand in the rain. I checked the property deed on my phone. My name alone. Unambiguous. The weight of it settled differently now. Not as threat, not as leverage. Simply as acknowledgement. I am entitled here, whether anyone recognizes it or not. And for the first time in a long time, that knowledge was comforting. Quiet, steady comfort, like the roots of a tree beneath snow. Later, the girls emerged, chattering and laughing, oblivious to my presence outside. I watched them go about their morning routines, their triumphs, their small victories over a man who had simply chosen not to fight for their attention. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was observing, noting, calculating, not in some vengeful sense, but with a clarity that comes from finally seeing the truth. I walked back inside, the floorboards creaking softly under my weight. I moved through the house as if I were invisible, not needing to be seen, not needing validation. Every room spoke of my labor, my contributions, my presence, but it no longer demanded acknowledgement. I had learned that silence doesn't erase you, but it can teach others exactly how far they can go without consequence. By lunchtime, I had made a few calls, routine, professional but deliberate. Not to complain, not to explain, not to announce. Just to act. And in that action, I felt a subtle shift. The world outside the house kept moving, unaware, indifferent, and perfectly suited to my new approach. Measured, calm, contained. Even my phone, buzzing occasionally with messages from my wife, went unanswered for stretches. Not to punish, not to prove a point, but simply to remind myself that my focus did not require external approval. Every unanswered text was a quiet assertion of presence, a declaration that I existed on my own terms, silently, steadily, invisibly. By evening, the tension had not dissipated, but it had changed shape. I no longer felt like a man shrinking in the shadows. I felt like a man observing the theater around him, quietly noting the roles others assumed, the boundaries they enforced, and the mistakes they would inevitably make. Patience, I realized, was not weakness. It was preparation. Dinner came, and I ate alone in the kitchen, savoring the silence that had once been unbearable. The house hummed with life beyond the walls of the dining room, but it did not reach me. And that distance, calculated, intentional, was mine to own. As I washed the dishes afterward, I allowed myself a thought that had been foreign for years. I do not need permission to exist. I do not need validation to act. And I do not need to be loud to be heard. The morning had been a revelation. The day had been a rehearsal. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, I felt the first spark of control, steady and unshakable, that I had not felt in a long time. I left the kitchen, the plates stacked neatly, the counter wiped clean. I walked to the office once more, sat at the desk, and closed my eyes. I imagined the days ahead, not the arguments, not the confrontations, not the humiliation, but the path I could choose. Silent, deliberate, intentional. And I knew, with a certainty that felt almost terrifying, that nothing would happen in that house without my awareness from this point forward. I would not be moved without choice. I would not be dismissed without consequence. And in that realization, I found a strange kind of peace. The sun was dipping low outside when I finally allowed myself to stand. The house had not changed, and neither had they. But I had. And that was the point. That quiet assertion, that small, unseen shift, was enough to carry me forward. Enough to prepare me for what I knew, deep down, was coming. Because patience had a price, and it was time to see what I was willing to pay. I didn't answer the phone at first. I let it ring while I sat in the living room, the sunlight slanting through the blinds, cutting sharp lines across the floor. I knew who it was before I even picked it up, and I wasn't wrong. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. It was a lawyer confirming details about the house. An offer had come in, and I was the only one authorized to act. The realization hit me quietly. I could move faster than anyone anticipated. Faster than they thought I would, slower than they hoped I would. My fingers rested on the laptop keys for a long time before I logged in, knowing every click would carry more weight than a shout ever could. Later that day, the girls were in the kitchen, whispering again, thinking their father's stepfather was too weak to notice. I didn't need to hear their exact words to understand the rhythm of their entitlement. Laughter like they'd already won, voices dancing around the edges of the truth without stepping directly into confrontation. I leaned against the doorframe and watched. Not in anger. Not in judgment. Observation. Steady, patient, controlled. They assumed I would beg, that I would argue, that I would make myself small to appease them. But that assumption had been their greatest mistake. I had learned to let the world announce itself without my consent, and this time, my consent wasn't on the table. My wife walked past, a brief glance my way that didn't last, her face neutral, unreadable. She didn't intervene, didn't correct, didn't even sigh. That had always been her strategy. Avoid the storm, let it pass, hope it disappears. This time, it wouldn't. Not because I was angry, but because I had clarity now, and clarity doesn't require emotion to be effective. I moved to my office, the sound of the girls' chatter fading behind me. The desk was a familiar territory, a space where I had always felt competent. I opened the bank portal and reviewed the numbers, calculations, approvals, transfer confirmations. Every step precise, deliberate, silent. I didn't need to announce anything. My power existed in my action, invisible but immutable. By afternoon, a message from one of the girls appeared on my phone, teasing, testing, daring me to show any sign of weakness. I didn't reply. Not yet. I let the words hang in the digital void. My silence was a weight heavier than any argument I could have made. They didn't know it, but every unread message was a small measure of control reclaiming the narrative. I checked the offer details again. Everything was legal, clear, in my name alone. I considered their assumptions about me. They thought I would cower, beg, explain myself endlessly. Instead, I was moving quietly, methodically. Each decision measured, each action deliberate. No drama, no spectacle. Just inevitable progress. The afternoon sunlight dimmed as I packed a few personal items into a box. Not much. Just what I wanted to see leave with me. I paused, looking at family photos on the wall. Smiles frozen in glass. Memories that once belonged to everyone now felt strangely private. I didn't take the photos yet. I didn't need to. My presence alone had begun to speak. Later, the girls came into the office, pretending casual curiosity. I looked up, calmly, without surprise. The weight of my gaze was enough to unsettle them, though I said nothing. They expected panic, confusion, anger. They got a steady calm, and that silence was louder than anything they could have shouted. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" one of them asked, the edge of challenge in her voice. I didn't answer immediately. I let the words hang. The quiet was deliberate, a mirror reflecting their own uncertainty back at them. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said finally, calm, measured, and complete. No explanation followed. None was needed. They weren't ready to hear it, and they wouldn't be until it was too late. The lawyer called again that evening, confirming the timing. Everything could move forward immediately if I wished. I felt a strange combination of detachment and empowerment. I wasn't acting out of spite. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply asserting what had always been mine, silently reclaiming what had been assumed was disposable. I walked through the kitchen later, the girls sitting at the table, pretending innocence. I didn't speak. I didn't announce plans. My silence was deliberate, a quiet announcement of my autonomy. Every glance, every small movement, carried more authority than a shouted accusation ever could. I went to the front door and looked out at the street, imagining the reactions, the assumptions, the inevitable surprise that awaited them in the coming days. I allowed a small, controlled exhale. Power often doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be inevitable. By the time the evening settled, the girls had retreated, leaving me in the quiet of my living room. I sat on the couch, hands folded, mind tracing every decision, every potential consequence. I was aware of my restraint. I was aware of their misjudgment. And I was aware that the storm was approaching, measured, deliberate, and entirely within my control. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of anxiety, but because of anticipation, the calm before inevitable realization. Every unchecked assumption they had made about me had led to this moment. And every assumption would crumble silently, without spectacle, without dramatics, but undeniably. For the first time in a long while, I felt the satisfaction that comes not from victory announced, but from power quietly exercised. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't explaining. I wasn't shrinking. I was present, deliberate, and prepared. And that presence, silent and unyielding, was the first step toward the reckoning that would finally make them understand who I had been all along. The day began in stillness. I moved through the house with careful steps, not to announce myself, not to be seen, but to occupy the space deliberately. The morning sunlight fell across the counters and the floorboards, illuminating dust motes that danced lazily in the air. I had noticed them before, but now they seemed to mark the passage of time differently, time I was reclaiming silently, purposefully, one small action at a time. I sat at my desk, opening the property documents for the third time that morning. Each line, each signature, each figure carried the weight of inevitability. There was no fanfare, no shouting, no dramatic confrontations. Paperwork doesn't raise its voice, but it speaks louder than any argument ever could. And I had learned to let it speak for me. I reviewed the steps carefully, confirming the buyer, the transfer dates, the final approvals. Everything was legal, clear, and irrevocably in my name. A sense of calm settled over me. Not triumph, not vengeance, just clarity. I was acting within my rights, and that action, silent as it was, would force acknowledgement in its own time. The girls wandered through the house again, their voices a mixture of curiosity and mischief. They assumed their father's stepfather would panic, would plead, would call them out. But I did none of those things. I moved steadily, arranging documents, packing a few personal items, small, deliberate gestures that required neither explanation nor announcement. I allowed them to see nothing, to guess at everything. Later, my wife passed by, glancing at me with a question in her eyes that she dared not speak aloud. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The quiet I maintained was a language she understood imperfectly but could not ignore. Power, I realized, often comes from restraint. It does not need performance, it needs inevitability. I spent the afternoon making a few phone calls, lawyers, banks, service providers. Each conversation was precise, measured, deliberate. No emotions were attached, no explanations offered. The world outside the house continued unaware, indifferent to my presence, and that indifference suited me perfectly. My actions were unseen but consequential, and that was exactly the point. The sun moved lower, slanting across the walls as if marking the slow march of my decisions. I checked the emails again. Approvals, confirmations, transfers, everything was aligned. There was no drama, no confrontation, no shout for attention. Just certainty. Just clarity. Just action. I found myself thinking about all the times silence had been mistaken for weakness. Each small compromise, each swallowed word, had been misread as acceptance. But I had learned that quiet can teach lessons louder than any raised voice. And today, that lesson was in motion, steady, inevitable. The girls peeked into my office once more, their faces painted with assumed control. I looked up, meeting their gaze with calm certainty. No one said a word. My silence alone unsettled them more than any accusation could have. The balance had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was real. They had assumed the worst about me and discovered nothing about me they could control. By evening, the house had begun to settle into its usual rhythms again, unaware that change had already begun. I packed the last of my personal items, small mementos that had little value to anyone but me. I didn't rush. I didn't announce my intentions. Everything moved at a deliberate pace, measured, controlled, inevitable. My phone buzzed with messages from my wife, questions, half-sent thoughts, an attempt at contact. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish, but because my focus no longer required her validation. Every unanswered text was a quiet boundary, a statement of self-possession. I paused in the hallway, looking at the girls' rooms. They were unaware of the weight I now carried in my silence. Every decision I had made today, every calm action, had shifted the dynamic in ways they wouldn't fully recognize until it was irreversible. And that thought brought a steady satisfaction, different from triumph, richer than revenge. I sat in the living room as twilight settled, the house now hushed, the evening deepening. I allowed myself a long, slow exhale, feeling the clarity of the day. Paperwork, decisions, silent actions, none of it made noise, none of it sought recognition. And yet, it had already begun to command attention, inevitably, without spectacle. I went to bed that night knowing that the following morning would be different. Not because I would be louder, not because I would demand acknowledgement, but because my quiet, deliberate choices had already set the wheels in motion. Power, I realized, often waits quietly, and when it moves, it is unstoppable. Morning came with a kind of deliberate quiet I had grown accustomed to. The sunlight stretched across the floors, unbroken, indifferent, as if the house itself had not yet realized the change underway. I moved through the rooms slowly, deliberately, observing what had once been my life in miniature. The arrangement of furniture, the scattered papers, the faint hum of appliances, but now seen through the lens of anticipation rather than comfort. The girls emerged, full of their usual chatter, laughing and teasing, assuming that I would wake to their antics as always. But today, I did not respond. Not with anger, not with explanation, not even with acknowledgement. I let them believe the world remained as it always had, that their assumptions were correct. It was in that assumption that the quiet power of my decisions would finally take root. I checked my phone intermittently, messages from my wife blinking in the screen, questions, feigned concern, little threads of control she hoped to maintain. I did not answer. Every unanswered message was a quiet assertion of presence, a small but deliberate reclaiming of the narrative they had long taken for granted. Breakfast passed without acknowledgement. The girls spoke over each other, testing, daring, but I remained a steady presence. Not cold, not vindictive, just deliberate and calm. I had learned that power does not require emotion. It requires precision, patience, and inevitability. Mid-morning, I received confirmation from the lawyer. All the paperwork had been processed, the house transfer was legally complete, and there was nothing more to do except collect the minimal personal belongings I had prepared. I felt neither glee nor triumph, only an odd calm that settled like a stone in my chest. Finally, my actions had matched the clarity of my intentions. I began the process of gathering the items I would take with me, small boxes, carefully packed, deliberate in content. Each object, chosen without haste, carried weight not for its value but for its symbolism, a reminder that what I had built and maintained had not been for their ownership. Every step was quiet, controlled, silent, and deliberate. The girls noticed, of course, their assumptions wobbling, unspoken questions flickering in their eyes. But I said nothing. My silence spoke volumes, a language they had ignored for too long. My wife appeared at the doorway, eyes widened slightly, a question on the tip of her tongue. I did not answer. I did not need to. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked finally, the words hesitant, uncertain, breaking through the veneer of casual indifference she had cultivated. I paused, carefully choosing my words, my tone calm, deliberate. "You already knew," I said. No more, no less. No explanation, no apology, no need for debate. Just statement. The weight of inevitability carried in that simple phrase. She looked at me then, truly looked, as if noticing me for the first time in months. Her gaze flickered between disbelief, regret, and perhaps a hint of recognition. I did not meet her with anger. I did not need to. My presence, deliberate, silent, and unyielding, was enough. The girls' chatter faded, replaced by confusion and quiet speculation. The house itself seemed to hold its breath as the realization settled in. I was no longer moving in the space as a tolerated guest. I was departing as a deliberate, self-directed force whose actions had already set the future in motion. By noon, the final boxes were in the car. The lawyer had called to confirm that every legal obligation had been met, and that there was no possibility of reversal. The girls hovered, unsure, testing, hoping for some reaction, some plea, some demonstration that their assumptions were correct. But I offered none. I had learned that silence and measured action could accomplish more than any argument or confrontation ever could. I walked through the house one last time, noting the small details, the faded marks on the walls where furniture had pressed too long, the scratches on the floors that told stories of years gone by. Each detail was a memory, a testament to what had been built quietly, often unacknowledged, always steady. I left nothing behind except the understanding that what was mine could not be erased by indifference or entitlement. The door closed behind me, the lock clicking softly, final, deliberate. I did not look back. My car started, and I drove away slowly, deliberately, savoring the rhythm of control, the quiet satisfaction of inevitability. The world outside continued, unaware, indifferent, as if nothing had changed, but inside, I felt a shift, subtle yet absolute. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of decision resting fully in my hands, unshared, unchallenged. I had not shouted, I had not begged, I had not explained. I had acted. And that action, quiet, deliberate, and unstoppable, had begun to recalibrate the assumptions of those who had long believed me weak. The road stretched ahead, empty, clean, a reflection of the clarity I had found within myself. I thought of the days ahead, not in fear, not in anticipation of confrontation, but in acknowledgement of control regained, autonomy reclaimed, and dignity preserved. I did not need acknowledgement. I did not need applause. My power was measured not in recognition, but in the deliberate, inevitable unfolding of events I had quietly set in motion. And as I drove away from the house, leaving the assumptions, the misunderstandings, and the unspoken grievances behind, I understood fully for the first time. The man they had underestimated would no longer be defined by their perceptions, but by the steady, silent assertion of his own clarity and self-possession. The night before I left, I didn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, not because I feared confrontation, but because my mind was alive with clarity. Every decision I had made so far, the silence, the patience, the deliberate actions, had brought me to this exact moment. And now I realized nothing could undo it. Not words, not anger, not pleading. Only my own choice could shape the next day, and I had chosen deliberately. I walked through the house in the dim light, touching surfaces that once felt like extensions of my life. Each room spoke memories, small victories, quiet failures, laughter and arguments preserved in dust and scratches. I paused in front of the dining table, the very table where the stepdaughters had humiliated me without remorse. I didn't sit. I didn't speak. I simply stood, feeling the weight of every slight, every dismissal, every assumption of weakness that had been laid upon me. The decision didn't come as a flash. It had been simmering, built upon every moment I had allowed my silence to teach others what I would tolerate. I had learned that restraint was power, patience was authority, and clarity was unstoppable. And now I would act from that clarity, not from emotion, not from spite, but from purpose. I checked the legal confirmation one last time. Everything was irrevocable. The house could be sold immediately, no contest, no interference. My hands rested lightly on the keys as I imagined the reactions, the disbelief, the shock, the sudden awareness that the man they had underestimated had acted decisively, silently, and without announcement. My chest was calm, steady. No rush, no drama. Just inevitable action. Morning arrived with a pale light, brushing across the walls, revealing the quiet order I had restored for myself. The girls came down, their chatter unguarded, unaware of the magnitude of what had occurred in their absence. I remained calm, deliberate. Not one word betrayed the storm they were about to discover. My wife poured her coffee, glanced at me once, and looked away. The weight of inevitability hadn't yet reached her. I gathered the final boxes into the car, careful, deliberate. Each movement measured, precise, controlled. Not a sound, not a declaration, not a plea. The house hummed around me, unaware that its foundation was shifting, that ownership was about to be redefined, not through confrontation but through simple, unstoppable action. I paused at the doorway, glanced back. The girls looked up, curious, playful, not yet sensing the change. I smiled faintly, a private acknowledgement of the strategy that had brought me here. My silence had been my shield. My patience had been my tool. And now, my clarity was my weapon. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain. The consequences would speak for themselves. I drove away slowly, the street stretching ahead like a line of opportunity, clean and unbroken. Behind me, the house stood unchanged in appearance, but it would never be the same. The quiet decision I had made was already in motion, reshaping assumptions, shifting dynamics, rewriting the story they thought they controlled. By mid-morning, the transfer was official. I had acted decisively, without spectacle, without argument, without drama. The house belonged to someone else now, legally, completely. My power lay in action, not announcement. And I reveled in the certainty that every assumption about my weakness, every belief in my passivity, had been proven wrong silently, absolutely. Messages began to come in, tentative, confused, from both the girls and my wife. I read them but did not respond. Not out of anger, not to punish, but because clarity does not require validation. I had acted, the consequences were unfolding, and my silence allowed them to process the reality of my choice. Every unanswered text reinforced the inevitability, every delay in reaction amplified the lesson. I parked the car later and watched from a distance. The girls' expressions shifted slowly, disbelief giving way to dawning comprehension. My wife called, hesitated, tried to reach me. I did not answer. Not because I sought to hurt, but because clarity cannot be hurried. The lesson of restraint, of deliberate, controlled action, was something they had to see unfold on its own. And now they were seeing it. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. I felt a weight lift, not dramatically, but as a quiet acknowledgement of authority regained. I had chosen not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of clarity and self-possession. My life, my decisions, my boundaries, they were mine again quietly, completely, irrevocably. As night fell, I sat in my car, letting the silence stretch around me. The realization settled in. The turning point was not loud. It was deliberate, patient, silent, and unstoppable. And in that quiet moment, I felt an unexpected calm, a sense of power that no words could articulate, no argument could undermine. I had acted. The consequences were unfolding. And I would not be defined by others' assumptions ever again. I arrived home that evening with an unusual quiet surrounding me. The street was empty, the sky painted with the muted colors of twilight, and the house waited like an expectant audience, unaware of the reckoning it was about to witness. I didn't rush inside. I didn't announce myself. I stood in the driveway for a long moment, letting the anticipation settle, letting the inevitability of the next moments take shape. The girls were inside, of course, laughing and talking, oblivious to the fact that the balance of the house had already shifted. They assumed everything was normal, as if the man they had underestimated would continue to tolerate their behavior, their whispers, their subtle triumphs. But this time, nothing would be as they expected. I walked to the door slowly, deliberately, each step a silent prelude to the consequence they hadn't yet realized. Inside, the house smelled familiar, yet alien. The furniture, the photos, the air itself, everything remained the same outwardly, but the energy had shifted. I carried no anger, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. I didn't need to. My presence alone had begun to command attention, the weight of clarity settling like gravity around them. I passed the living room, where they had gathered, teasing and giggling. Their eyes flickered toward me, questioning, uncertain. I said nothing. I simply moved, deliberate and steady, through the space I had claimed silently, my calm a mirror to their unspoken panic. Each step reinforced that I was no longer a man to be overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. My wife finally looked up from her chair, recognition dawning too slowly. What are you doing?" she asked, voice shaky, uncertain, betraying both disbelief and the sudden understanding that I had acted decisively while they assumed I would hesitate. I didn't answer at first. I let the silence stretch, let the weight of inevitability fill the room. It was a language they had all learned to ignore for too long, and now it spoke fluently. The girls exchanged glances, whispering quickly, the earlier confidence faltering. They had assumed their teasing, their jokes, and their mother's complicity gave them control over the narrative. They had assumed I would plead, argue, explain, beg. But I had learned the potency of silent, measured action. They were about to learn it too. Finally, I spoke, calm, deliberate. The house has been sold. The words landed softly, but the effect was seismic. I watched the color drain from their faces, the laughter vanish from their eyes, replaced by disbelief and panic. My wife's jaw tightened. She looked to the girls for answers they did not have. No one spoke for a long moment. The silence itself was an assertion of power, more absolute than any raised voice could have been. The girls started to ask questions, rapid fire, but I didn't answer. Their confusion, their rising panic only underscored the magnitude of my choice. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to defend. I had acted, deliberately, legally, inevitably. And now they faced the reality of their assumptions shattered. What do you mean, sold? My wife whispered finally, her voice betraying both fear and disbelief. I met her gaze calmly. I mean exactly that. Sold. Completed. Legal. Done. Each word was steady, measured, absolute. No emotion, no apology, no lecture, just clarity. The weight of inevitability carried the authority. No dramatics were needed. I watched the girls crumble quietly, the false sense of control evaporating before their eyes. My presence was enough, but the finality of the paperwork was unstoppable. They hadn't expected this. None of them had. Their world, carefully constructed around my supposed weakness, had collapsed silently and irrevocably. I moved past them to collect a few remaining items, not for dramatic effect, not to prove a point, but because I had chosen what to take. Each motion, deliberate and quiet, reinforced the lesson they were only beginning to comprehend. Power doesn't always need volume. Sometimes, it simply needs inevitability. By nightfall, the house was quiet again, but now the silence was different. It was a silence of comprehension, of reluctant acknowledgement. They were forced to see that the man they had underestimated, mocked, and dismissed had acted decisively, calmly, and irrevocably. And they could do nothing about it. I stepped outside once more, letting the air fill my lungs. The weight of the day, the quiet climax of my actions, settled over me. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel anger. I felt clarity, control regained, boundaries respected, and for the first time in years, I felt the quiet, steady satisfaction of inevitability fully realized. The night stretched ahead, calm, unbroken. I did not need to speak further, to justify, to explain. I had acted. The consequences were now self-evident, silent, and absolute. And in that quiet I realized, true power comes not from aggression, not from confrontation, not from shouting. It comes from restraint, clarity, and the deliberate, inevitable exercise of choice. The morning after the sale, the house felt smaller, though it had not changed. The walls, the floors, the rooms remained exactly as they had been, but the energy had shifted, subtly and irreversibly. I didn't need to announce anything. I didn't need to witness their reactions up close. The quiet knowledge of action completed, inevitability fulfilled, settled over me like a steady weight, grounding and unshakable. I poured a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp, the neighborhood waking around me, oblivious to the quiet upheaval inside the walls I once occupied. The girls were not laughing now. Their voices were muted, tentative. I did not need to see them to know the effect of my choices. Silence had spoken louder than any confrontation could have, and it had been understood. Messages from my wife had come and gone overnight, unanswered, read but unacknowledged. She was learning the lesson slowly, the truth of my deliberate clarity pressing in without explanation, without spectacle. I did not feel triumph, not even satisfaction in the conventional sense. I felt steadiness, a restored sense of self and boundaries that had long been assumed absent. I walked through the house one last time, taking in the familiar corners, the traces of years spent here, the life built quietly. The dining room, once the stage for humiliation, now seemed like a space cleared of expectation. The bedrooms, the living room, the study, all remained as they were, yet everything had shifted. Ownership, not of property alone, but of presence, had been reclaimed in silence, in clarity, in deliberate action. By late morning, I was gone. My car carried me away not in haste, not in anger, but in quiet acknowledgement of autonomy regained. The road ahead felt wide, unbroken, a reflection of the calm power that comes from acting decisively while remaining patient. I did not need applause. I did not need recognition. I had exercised control over what was mine, and the universe, indifferent as it was, had confirmed it. I thought of the girls, of my wife, of the assumptions that had held me small for so long. They would process the events in their own time, wrestling with disbelief, perhaps resentment, perhaps understanding. I would not chase their comprehension. I would not demand acknowledgement. The lesson had been delivered quietly, irreversibly, with clarity and restraint. The afternoon light softened as I stopped at a small overlook, watching the horizon stretch beyond familiar streets. I allowed myself to breathe, to feel the weight of the day, the calm of inevitability settling into my bones. The steps I had taken, the patience I had exercised, and the clarity I had maintained were mine alone, yet they had reshaped the world around me. I realized then that reclamation does not always announce itself with fanfare. True empowerment comes quietly, from measured choices, from the restraint to act without drama, from the patience to let actions speak before words. I had learned that silence can be louder than outrage, and inevitability stronger than confrontation. By evening, the sense of completion was steady, unbroken. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The house was no longer mine in property, but the boundaries, the autonomy, the self-possession I had reclaimed would accompany me wherever I went. That, I realized, was the most permanent possession of all. As night settled, I allowed a small, private smile. I had acted. I had reclaimed my space, my presence, my clarity. The world continued, indifferent as always, but I was no longer defined by their assumptions, their dismissals, or their silence. I had chosen quietly, deliberately, and irrevocably. And that choice was enough. In that quiet reclamation, I found not only control but peace. The lessons of patience, silence, and deliberate action had been tested and fulfilled. And I stepped forward, unshaken, carrying the weight of autonomy, clarity, and self-possession into every day that followed.